Well, you tweeted something the other day. I'm going to read it, and I agree with you. I actually commented on it last night. You said, "What if China is purposely shutting down its country to wreak havoc on the global supply chain even further and to exert its power over the quality of lives of the Western world? We're being told by our media that it's a COVID, zero COVID. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I really align with what you said in that it seems just a little weird that 3 years into this mess, we're just going to start locking down for long periods of time, knowing what it's going to do to the rest of the world." So can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I will say I don't know that anyone knows why. I mean, this is if you sort of look at what's happening right now, this being mid-April, we're doing this conversation. I think it's April 19th, and one of the things that sort of is sort of shocking is that the Chinese government, for really the last 3 weeks in Shanghai and in Guangzhou, and sort of put perspective of what those cities represent is, it's like Shanghai is the equivalent of New York City. It's the financial center of China. It's the most cosmopolitan city in China. It tends to be Western focused. A lot of expats, international corporations headquartered in Shanghai. The Chinese government has sort of let it run because it's all about sort of money, and sort of think of the way New York is. Beijing is equivalent of Washington, D.C., very political focused, and Shanghai is sort of the New York. And essentially they've locked this entire city down. And if you think of like what that means as an American, we talk about these egregious lockdown. Maybe California is an example of what that looked like for an American, which seemed extreme to a Tennessean or a Texan or a Floridian, like the fact that San Francisco won't let you go into a restaurant without a mask, or you couldn't leave. You could walk outside, but the Chinese have taken that to an extreme, which they literally have barricaded people in their homes. They've locked the fences around some of these apartment complexes that are in China, because these are mostly high-rise buildings that you see in these cities, and they have drones and police that are out there to arrest you. And let's keep in mind, the worst place you can possibly be, probably in the world, is a Chinese prison. Like an autocratic regime, you're not going to be treated well. Like American prisons, as bad as they are, have nothing on Chinese prisons, and so nobody wants to be locked up. I mean, you may never come back, and that is the threat that the government has done. They've completely shut down Shanghai, and then Guangzhou, which is the world's sort of the most important manufacturing city in China, they've shut that down too. And so they've shut down 40% of their economy. And the question is why? To your point, we spent 2 years with COVID. We in the West sort of have learned to live with it. It's not something we've enjoyed, but we've learned to live with it. We've adapted. And over the past, say, 6 months, we said, screw it. I'm going to go out and do what I want to do. And if I get sick, maybe I'm vaccinated. Most people are. Maybe I'm not. But I'm going to deal with it. And I will take the risk of getting COVID because there's great treatment and understanding of how this stuff travels. And for 2 years, the Chinese government and media claimed that they did not have an outbreak of cases. They had no deaths for 2 years. So the first part of the virus, they had a lot of deaths in Wuhan, and they sort of locked it down. And the Chinese government told their people that it was under control, that there was nothing to worry about. All of a sudden, Omicron, which is a relatively mild illness, sort of takes hold. We know how contagious it was here in the United States, and it's sort of taken hold. And all of a sudden, the Chinese government, after 2 years, has decided to shut down its economy. The most important cities in China, 2 of the 3 biggest cities, the only one they haven't shut down is Beijing, which is where the central government is. You have to ask yourself why. And I don't have those answers. A lot of reasons of why people have suggested it. Is it economic issues? Is it that the U.S. consumers are no longer pulling on demand, and that's slowing down the amount of orders, and therefore it's showing the amount of dollars that are flowing into China? Possibility. Is it because the Chinese government, because they're not able to deliver growth and prosperity, has said this grand bargain we have with people is starting to fray, and they're really worried about political tension that may show up? Quite possible and probable. Is it because they have a food crisis and an energy crisis? Now, here's one of the sort of astounding things about China. China imports at least, so they're one of the most food insecure nations in the world, and probably are the most, if you sort of look at the amount of food insecurity they have, they're one of the most food insecure nations in the world. They import about 8% of the food that they eat, they import it. Counter that to the United States, we export 35% of the food. Our farmers are so good at what they do. And the technology and that we use to farmers, they're just so productive. We have no choice but to export it. In fact, the U.S. government pays farmers not to produce because we're so good at it. They don't want all these products flooding the market. We're just that good. China's the opposite. The other thing that China has to import is energy. So oil and nat gas, they're the world's largest importer of oil. They import 65% of the energy that they consume in China is imported from outside the world. And you think about those manufacturing plants and factories that really make up China, it takes a lot of energy to produce that. And we saw last year during the summer that they had rolling brownouts and blackouts because they didn't have enough energy to supply the grid. So here we are in April of 2022, and all of a sudden they have these rapid lockdowns, and we in America and a Western orientation cannot answer why. Now, part of this is I don't know the answer. There are people that believe that it's an attack on Americanization and the Western economies, and as you pointed out, the quote that I retweeted came out of I think a New York Times article that Zero Hedge had republished.
That's right.
Was basically this idea that maybe China is enacting all of this pain on the West because it wants to demonstrate its power. That is a possibility, and I'm not discounting it. And I think it's a compelling possibility. But probably as compelling or likely is that China is in an unprecedented position in this post-Cold War world that they've never known, which they can no longer guarantee growth. And with inflation of food and energy being so substantial since the Russian conflict or war, that because of the way that the Chinese economy works, is they don't want the flow of U.S. dollars leaving their economy. They have to buy all these products, and they're trying to save off inflation as much as possible. And the best way to do that is to slow down production. That is just as likely is that this is a reaction based on economics and their inability to control runaway inflation and concern about social pressures inside their own country that very well may be causing some of this. And so I think it's quite possible both of those things are at play, is that they have internal pressures caused by hyperinflation and pressures caused by what's happening in the West and still trying to be a factor in how the Western economies work. There's also a third possibility, which has been brought up, is that the premier of China, President Xi, is an autocratic dictator of a very powerful country, but is largely isolated from any of the information on the ground. Chinese media sort of is the voice piece of the government. There is no third-party media. Certainly, freightways would probably be banned, and we're like an insignificant portion of media in the United States. We probably wouldn't exist or allowed to be exist. I'd probably be arrested for even writing stuff that isn't official. And because China has this lockdown media, and it's built as a country where information is supposed to be positive and endearing to how great the premier's and President Xi's government is, it's quite possible that what is happening inside the country is just that the government bureaucrats are committed to the zero tolerance policy and are just executing that because they think that's what's expected of them. And then the information to stop it isn't getting up to the key decision makers, and they're not believing or hearing or seeing what we're seeing in the West. And there's just so many questions I don't have the answers to. I can't, as an American, comprehend it, frankly. Like, it seems really bizarre. But I'm also an American. I'm a capitalist. And none of this stuff makes sense. So any of those possibilities are quite possible. And I don't know that we have the answers.
Oh, man, this is so freaking good. Just a comment on what you just said, and for people listening, It's something I think about a lot. It's piggybacking off what you just said. America is a media-run state. We let these third-party media outlets kind of dictate the narrative, and China is a state-run media, meaning it comes from one part. I don't know the right answer, but they each have their faults, and we know why. So it's fascinating to think about it that way. All right, so you've been kind of vocal about, um, there's even part of America now is like China's going to eat our lunch. They're going to win, and you tweeted something again the other day, and I was like, this made my day. Maybe I may have said it made my month. That you have a different opinion. You think that this plays into our favor. And obviously you have a lot of data backing up some of these probably things that you're thinking. So let's kind of keep moving the conversation that way. What does all this mean? We can talk about today, but let's kind of think in context over the next decade. What does this mean for America that China is kind of waking up to a world that is going to be a lot different than the last 30 years that made them great?
Yeah, so one of the and we've talked about the bargain that Chinese government had with its people, but the Chinese government and the Chinese economy had this grand bargain with the West, or the West, we should say, had a grand bargain, is basically provide us cheap goods, make it so that those flow of goods continue to flow over, and we'll let you do whatever you want to do to your own people. Like, just stay out of our way as Americans, and we'll protect the global oceans. We'll keep oil flowing, even though the majority of that oil doesn't come to the United States. Our navies will protect the waters. And you as a government, and we'll be the global reserve currency, but just all you have to do as Chinese is make sure that our goods flow and our supply chains are dependable. And as Americans, as capitalists, we were okay. We didn't like it. We didn't like the environmental policies of the Chinese. We're willing to sort of let them play in a different playing field. We certainly didn't like how they treated their own people, but we were willing to ignore it so long as products flowed into the United States because we're greedy consumers. Like, we like cheap goods. We like going to Target and Walmart and buying something that's, a t-shirt that's like $10 and shoes that are like $15 or Nikes that are $60. We enjoyed unprecedented prosperity as consumers and unmatched prosperity because we made this grand bargain with the Chinese. But the Chinese have broken that. And what they've broken it is that the autocratic regime of China has attacked that system and is now no longer a dependable source of products. And if they're willing to shut down their economy and the supply chains that we as American businesses and consumers depend on, then that matters to us. All of a sudden, we care. And the reason we care is we can no longer depend on them as trading partners because they're no longer going to stay with the grand bargain that we had with them as a trading partner. And so as American business owners are looking at all of this instability in China, where all of a sudden products are no longer flowing like they used to flow, and they've shut down their economy, and we no longer can depend on the items that we need. So we have a couple of choices. And so what you see is companies are now holding more inventory than they've ever held before because they want to make sure that they don't run out of those products. COVID taught them they must have inventory on hand. And if you go back to 2021, go back to last year, and you look at the companies that exceeded earnings and the companies that missed earnings, it wasn't a demand problem. It wasn't really a product problem. It's entirely based on whether they had inventories. If they couldn't act upon a sell when a consumer came to the website or came to the store, they would do exceptionally well because they had inventory. The companies that didn't have those inventories that ended up missing earnings and were punished in the stock market. So you take two companies, take Target and take Bed Bath & Beyond. Target blew out its earnings. And it blew out its earnings because it had a robust supply chain and had product selection. It had prepared and managed through the supply chain crisis much better than Bed Bath & Beyond did, which tends to focus on low-end or, highly commoditized bath products and bedding products, which tend to be textile-based and largely come from China. What we've learned in that is that if you are a supply chain manager, and we're 2 years into this crisis, is that if you don't have a resilient supply chain and source of goods, that your company is going to be punished by Wall Street because the consumers are going to go somewhere else to buy the same product item from somewhere else. And that is a complete change because we no longer can depend on consistent flowing products from China. We have, as supply chain managers in the United States, are forced to say, what is the willingness that I'm willing to sit here and let Chinese government and Chinese politics and Chinese economy drive the success or failure of my business? And because of that, American supply chain professionals are starting to question, and are not just starting to question, but starting to act upon leaving China. Now, this is something we've talked about at FreightWaves since 2017, really since Donald Trump got elected. He was sort of the first person in government that was willing to challenge this post-Cold War system of this America-Chinese economic relationship. And I don't care what your politics are. At the end of the day, Donald Trump was the person that brought it to a head. There was people on the left that were uncomfortable with Chinese environmental and humanitarian rights, and there were people on the right that were sort of worried about Chinese military and China economic power. But at the end of the day, for most of the post-Cold War, we were sort of willing to deal with it. But Donald Trump came on and said that. And companies said, we sort of assumed that over time, companies would move manufacturing nearshore it, and they would move production, they would move inventory. It didn't happen. It's a lot of people that figured it would. And the reason it didn't happen for those first couple of years is that it felt like Donald Trump was just too erratic. We also sort of assumed as American businesses, if we just ride this guy out, like eventually he won't get elected. He'll manage to get himself unelected, which effectively happened. And so you essentially end up in this situation where we're sort of thinking in a post-Donald Trump world that whoever gets elected will sort of restore the world the way it was. COVID happens, massive disruption to supply chains. We have a new presidential party in power. President Biden doesn't reverse any of Donald Trump's trade policies. Regardless of what you said, he didn't reverse any of them. So we are now, as Americans, have established that we're willing to sort of challenge that world order. And then you have COVID that starts to massively disrupt things. And then the Chinese government starts to act really strange. And so then you're like, as an American business, can I really trust the Chinese as a consistent provider? Yes, it's true. They're cheap. Cheap labor, cheap products. But when I'm having to pay 10 times the price to move my freight containers from China to the United States, it has a significant cost. But more importantly, if I can't trust my vendor, if I can't trust my supplier, then I'm going to make choices of looking at nearshoring or onshoring as my appropriate choice for running my supply chain. So the winners of this are American warehouse operators, because I'm going to need to hold more inventory. I'm going to have my sources of products closer to my assembly and final production. Maybe I'm still importing cheap products from China. I'm just holding a lot more of it than I used to. Maybe I'm looking at places like Mexico as my assembly location and my factory locations. And I think what we're seeing is this reorientation of the world away from China. And it's happening. We're at FreightWaves getting a lot of demand for what we call site selection studies, which, if you sort of think about a supply chain, half of the cost in a supply chain. Well, I'm not talking about raw materials. I'm talking about running a supply chain. Half of the cost is in transportation. And that was based on data 2 years ago. If you look at it over the past 2 years, it's probably around 65%. So the largest line item in running a supply chain is transportation. And the thing that drives transportation expenses and cost is how far a product is from the final customer. And so if transportation is putting headwinds, and I can't trust my partner, the Chinese, and my Chinese vendors, and then I have the backdrop of fuel cost increases and inflation, I also have the backdrop of environmental concerns and carbon emissions that are sort of a lot of pressure there, then I have to start to re-question all of that. And at the same time, me as a supply chain executive who's been largely ignored because I'm a back office person is now being invited to spend time with the CFOs and CEOs of these companies. I'm now important and I now have a voice. I haven't had a voice before.
Oh man. I wish this could go on for 5 hours, but we still have a lot of time. Is there I have like several questions, but I'll just give a quick one and you don't have to you can answer it however you want. Is there anything to believe that we're going to wake up tomorrow and be like, "All right, China, never mind. Let's just chill out. Let's all go back to harmonious and get back in bed together and let the world resume," or enough, I don't want to call it damage, but enough has been done that we're going to start moving in a different direction. Is there any data or anything you're seeing
No,
that's even possible?
it's not happening.
Okay.
American businesses are no longer going to tolerate that. I mean, some products, low-end products, will always be sort of sourced elsewhere, but in terms of core manufacturing, no. It is a foregone conclusion that American businesses are now thinking about it. And supply chain executives have been wanting to move back and source products domestically, but have been largely ignored. I mean, CEOs of companies didn't even know who ran their supply chain 2 years ago. Never met with them, never talked to them.
Yep.
Sort of the back office shipping manager, right? And so now those very individuals are meeting with the CEOs on a weekly basis and talking to them about what's happening because they matter.
Is there anything so one of the arguments, we're going to talk about industrial real estate in a bit. That's what I do for a living. But, one of the arguments is, well, America's so slow. There's no way you can get all these companies back. It's too expensive, blah, blah, blah. Is there anything in Washington, any legislation, anything that maybe you're hearing about that's going to say, look, we're going to make it very easy for people to onshore again in America? Or is it going to be kind of grinding away? I mean, how if we need to get out of China, are we bringing it literally into the United States? Are we bringing it to Canada and Mexico? What's going on?
I think Mexico is your biggest winner here. And I think a lot of people sort of counter with the instability of the Mexican government. Well, Mexican government, the cartels are a real factor, but let's remember that the violence that they have is really cartel to cartel. Yeah, they pretty dire, but they tend to don't mess with the factories that are there. And let's not forget the cartels need transportation networks and freight networks to move their product.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're not going to import cocaine in a 53-foot trailer and like declare it at customs. You need alternative products to move. And so in many ways, these factories are sort of in cahoots. And so, yeah, there's going to be instability, but compared to the Chinese, if I have a disruption in my Mexican source, I will know about that much quicker. And the chances of it sort of shutting down and taking months to be resolved it's resolved in a week. And so it's going to be messy, but we're going to see products move to Latin America and Texas. I'm going to see more inventory. But Washington's going to largely ignore this, and that's fine. I mean, the fact is the government doesn't actually have a lot to do with the success of this or not. It's the market that will do it.
Well, okay, so let's just think about that for a second, though. If the government, though, is kind of you've kind of said whether you're Biden or Trump, you're kind of, they may say it in a different way, but we're kind of both on the same page that we're bringing things back. But then what you're saying is, but they're also going to take the stance of let the private markets figure out how this all shakes out. They're not going to say we're taking it back and we got to make it a little bit easier.
They don't have enough control. I mean, other than tariffs and some policy, they don't actually have a lot of control over American supply chains. I mean, they can sort of block products from around the world from either import or export. They have some control, but generally, American policy is sort of laissez-faire towards most businesses. I mean, business owners in America, we'd love to hate the government and all the regulations, but generally, the U.S. government is sort of hands-off when it comes to trade policy, except when they're implementing tariffs or restricting the flow of goods. But generally, there's not a whole lot the American government could do or would do to sort of drive this. It's just American businesses being real and saying, hey, if I want to compete, then I need my products. Because if I don't have those products and consumer spending is discretionary, then the consumer is going to go somewhere else.